Welcome to the Playing Books podcast.
Yeah, so glad to be here for this one.
Honestly, me too. Because today we are basically unlocking the ultimate instruction manual for your brain.
Yeah, which I think we all desperately need.
Totally. I mean, the mission for this episode is to give you, the listener, the exact tools you need to master subjects you previously thought were just like completely impossible for you to learn.
Right, those things you just wrote off years ago.
Exactly. And we're pulling all of this from this book, A Mind for Numbers: How to Excel at Math and Science, Even If You Flunked Algebra, by Barbara Oakley, PhD.
And I just want to say right off the bat, please do not let that title mislead you.
Yeah, for sure.
This is not an episode about, like, surviving high school chemistry. If you're an adult trying to pivot into a new, highly technical career or, trying to learn a new language from scratch.
Or even just trying to understand the dense financial architecture of your own retirement plan. I mean, the biological tools mapped out in this book are universally applicable.
Oh, absolutely. And the universality is really what makes Dr. Oakley's research so compelling. Because she didn't decode these mechanics from the ivory tower of a natural-born prodigy.
Right. She wasn't one of those kids who just saw the world in elegant equations from day one.
Not at all. I mean, she experienced the exact same cold, paralyzing dread that so many of us feel when we're confronted with a wall of technical information. She started from a place of profound inadequacy in these subjects.
And the extent of that inadequacy is kind of the perfect place to start, because growing up, Barbara Oakley actively loathed anything having to do with math or science.
Like, despised it?
Yeah, it wasn't just a mild distaste. As a child, she literally could not read a clock face.
Right, like an analog clock.
An analog clock on the wall.
Yeah.
The spatial relationship between the big hand and the little hand, the underlying fractions of an hour, it was just meaningless visual static to her.
Wow.
She couldn't even figure out the sequence of buttons on the television set, and she eventually just, flunked her way through her high school math and science courses.
Which leads to internalizing this incredibly damaging narrative, right?
Yeah.
She thought her brain was simply broken when it came to numbers.
Yeah, she believed they were sort of like this cognitive poison to be avoided at all costs.
And the scary thing is, that narrative becomes a self-fulfilling biological prophecy.
How so? Like, physically?
Yeah, literally. When you convince yourself that you lack a specific cognitive capacity, your brain actually prunes the neural pathways required to develop it.
You're kidding. So just believing you're bad at it makes you physically worse at it.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Because you stop engaging with the material, and when you stop engaging, you stop building those synaptic connections. So Oakley just leaned entirely into what she perceived as her inherent strengths, language, literature, history.
Well, I mean, that makes total sense. You gravitate toward what doesn't make you feel stupid. So right out of high school, she enlists in the Army specifically because they offer to pay her to learn a foreign language.
A great deal, honestly.
Right. She throws herself into Russian, and she is magnificent at it. I mean, she graduates with honors. Her pronunciation is so flawless that she's regularly mistaken for a native Russian speaker.
That's incredible.
She actually rises through the ranks to become a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army Signal Corps. So she seemingly conquered her world by entirely avoiding her weaknesses. But then the environment shifts.
Yeah, the military environment shifted dramatically. Suddenly, linguistic fluency wasn't the currency of advancement anymore.
Right, because she was stationed in West Germany, wasn't she?
Yeah, exactly. And as a Signal Corps officer there, she was expected to manage and understand these highly complex radio, cable, and telephone switching systems.
Oh, man.
So she gets thrown headfirst into this mathematically oriented electronics training. And predictably, given her lifelong avoidance of anything technical, she finishes at the absolute bottom of her class.
I can't even imagine the whiplash. Like going from being this top-tier, highly respected linguistic expert, completely in control of your destiny, to sitting at the bottom of a technical class, realizing you're just entirely pigeonholed.
Yeah, it was a total crisis of utility. She looked around and saw that the officers with technical problem-solving skills were the ones in demand.
And the language specialists are becoming obsolete in that specific theater.
Right. She realized that without those analytical skills, she would always be a second-class citizen in her own career.
Which forced a terrifying pivot. I mean, at the age of 26, an age where most people believe their cognitive strengths and weaknesses are permanently cemented, she decided to use her GI Bill funding to go back to school.
To fundamentally retrain her brain, from a complete math phobe to an engineering professional.
And the outcome is just staggering. She doesn't just scrape by. She earns a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, then a master's, and eventually a doctorate in systems engineering.
From flunking remedial trigonometry to mastering advanced thermodynamics and electromagnetics.
Yeah. She goes from someone who couldn't read a clock to a highly respected engineering professor. There's this quote early in the book that essentially serves as the thesis for her entire life. She says, "Being good at science and mathematics isn't just something you are, it's something you become."
And that idea requires us to completely dismantle a biological myth that has, quite frankly, crippled generations of learners.
You mean the left brain versus right brained thing?
Exactly. We are taught, almost from elementary school, this dichotomy of the left-brained analytical person versus the right-brained creative person.
Right, but I have to interject here because the persistence of that myth is just infuriating to me. We are culturally conditioned to believe in natural talent as this fixed asset.
It's pervasive.
But if a highly verbal, language-oriented person like Oakley, someone who couldn't read a clock, can literally rewire her neurology to understand advanced thermodynamics, does that mean the entire concept of natural talent is just a toxic excuse we use to avoid the discomfort of learning?
Honestly, it is largely a toxic limitation, yes.
Well,
I mean, while individuals certainly have varying baseline aptitudes, the brain is vastly more plastic than we historically believed. The whole left brain, right brain dichotomy is a massive, almost cartoonish oversimplification of neuroanatomy.
okay, so it's not about lacking a math gene.
Right. Oakley's realization wasn't that she lacked a specific math gene. Her realization was that she was trying to chop down a tree with a hammer.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
She was applying the wrong cognitive mechanisms to the task.
Hold on, you're losing me a bit, though. If she's using the wrong mechanisms, what are the right ones? Like, how does the brain actually process a new, terrifying piece of information like a complex equation if it's not just a matter of innate intelligence?
Well, to understand that, we have to look at how neuroscientists actually map brain activity. Through advanced imaging, we've discovered that the brain doesn't operate in a single continuous state of learning.
Okay.
It essentially toggles between two highly distinct, mutually exclusive neural networks. Dr. Oakley refers to these as the focused mode and the diffuse mode.
Oh, I want to break down how the book illustrates this because the metaphor used here completely changed how I view my own frustration when I'm working.
The pinball machine.
Yes. Oakley uses the metaphor of an old-school arcade pinball machine. Imagine you pull back that spring-loaded plunger, you release it, and a silver ball shoots up into the machine, right? Bouncing wildly off the rubber bumpers.
Right.
So in this metaphor, the silver ball is a thought, and the bumpers are your neural pathways.
Exactly. And the architecture of those bumpers defines the mode of thinking.
Right.
So when you are in the focus mode, which is heavily centered right behind your forehead in the prefrontal cortex, imagine that those rubber bumpers are packed very, very tightly together.
Okay, so they're super dense.
Extremely dense. Because they're so close, when you shoot a thought into that space, it bounces rapidly back and forth in a very localized, constrained area.
So this is what's happening when I'm, like, intensely concentrating on a spreadsheet or trying to conjugate a verb in Spanish that I've practiced 100 times. I'm firing that mental pinball into a tightly packed cluster of very familiar neural pathways.
Yes, precisely. The focus mode is analytical, sequential, and highly rational. It is essential for executing familiar tasks or doing the granular step-by-step work of solving a problem where you already know the underlying formula.
Okay, but what's the downside?
The biological limitation of the focus mode is its scope. Because the bumpers are so close together, the thought cannot travel to other areas of the brain. It's trapped in that specific neighborhood of knowledge.
Which brings us to the second mode, the diffuse mode.
Right.
Imagine that same pinball machine, but now the bumpers are spread incredibly far apart. There's massive open space on the board.
A completely different landscape.
Yeah. When you shoot the silver ball of a thought into this machine, it travels in long, sweeping trajectories. It arcs across the entire board, making wild, seemingly random connections with distant bumpers.
Biologically, this is a resting state network that is widely distributed across the entire brain, rather than just localized in the prefrontal cortex. It's the mode that allows for big-picture perspectives, sudden flashes of insight, and the synthesis of completely disparate ideas.
But wait, I need to clarify something. If the diffuse mode is just my brain wandering across a wide-open pinball machine, How is that any different from me just daydreaming about what I'm going to eat for dinner and getting absolutely no work done? Like, how do I actually harness a daydream?
That is the crucial distinction right there. The diffuse mode is only productive if you have first loaded the problem into your brain using the focused mode.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, the focus mode gathers the raw materials, the facts, the parameters of the problem, the specific data points. But when you hit a wall, when that tight cluster of bumpers doesn't contain the solution, you have to step away. You relax your attention.
So you let go.
You let go. That allows the brain to take the raw materials you just focused on and throw them into the wide open, diffuse network, searching for a novel connection.
Yeah.
You cannot be in both modes simultaneously. They are biologically mutually exclusive.
Which brings me to this amazing story from the book, because this actually happened. I want you to picture this. Imagine you are 13 years old.
Okay.
You are sitting across a chessboard from Garry Kasparov, a man widely considered to be one of the most terrifyingly brilliant, aggressive, and dominant chess champions in the history of the world.
Just horrifyingly intimidating.
Right. The room is silent. The tension is absolutely suffocating. It's a high-stakes, rapid-fire speed chess game. Kasparov is staring daggers into the board, his mind just churning through thousands of possible variations.
And you're 13.
You're 13. And right at the height of this intense psychological pressure, right when you should be concentrating harder than you ever have in your entire short life,
Yeah.
you stand up.
Yeah.
You turn your back on Kasparov. You start looking around at other people in the room. You just let your mind wander. It's so audacious.
Kasparov looked completely flustered, entirely thrown off his rhythm. But that 13-year-old kid, Magnus Carlsen, who would obviously go on to become a legendary world champion himself, he wasn't just playing psychological mind games.
No, he was executing a profound biological hack.
Yes.
He was manipulating the very architecture of his brain to solve a problem that pure, intense concentration could not. He was locked in the focused mode initially, analyzing specific pawn structures. But Kasparov had presented him with a board state that was just too complex for a localized solution.
So if Carlsen had kept staring at the board, his mental pinball would have just kept bouncing uselessly in that same tight circle.
Exactly. By standing up and looking away, he actively shut down his prefrontal cortex. He deliberately activated his diffuse mode, allowing his brain to see the massive, overarching architecture of the board, and he ended up playing Kasparov to a draw.
Which is just insane for a 13-year-old.
Again.
And it's a mechanism utilized by some of the most prolific creators in history. The book details the fascinating habits of Thomas Edison.
Oh, the ball bearing trick. I love this.
It's so good. When Edison was confronting a seemingly impossible engineering hurdle, he didn't just lock himself in a room and stare at blueprints for 48 hours straight.
No, he'd take a nap.
Kind of. He would sit down in a comfortable lounge chair with a handful of heavy metal ball bearings. He'd drape his hand over the armrest and deliberately let his mind wander freely. He would allow himself to drift into that hypnagogic state, that twilight zone right on the edge of sleep.
Where the brain's diffuse network is wildly active, generating bizarre, unconstrained connections.
Exactly. But if he falls asleep, he loses the thoughts. So the moment he actually crosses the threshold into sleep, his muscles relax. His hand opens. The heavy ball bearings drop onto a metal plate on the floor with a massive crash.
Boom, he jolts awake.
He jolts awake, immediately grabs a pen, and shifts instantly back into the tightly packed bumpers of the focus mode to write down the wide-ranging connections his diffuse brain had just generated. And Salvador Dali did the exact same thing, right? But with a heavy key and a plate to capture his surrealist visions.
Yes, they were literally catching their own brains in the act of diffuse thinking.
It perfectly illustrates the grand paradox of cognitive exertion. The very intensity of focus that is required to initially grapple with a problem is often the exact biological mechanism that prevents you from finding the fresh approach needed to solve it.
I feel like this explains a phenomenon I've experienced my entire life. It's like staring at one of those optical illusion magic eye posters from the 90s.
Oh man, those were so frustrating.
Right. If you stare at the static pattern and cross your eyes and strain and apply maximum focused effort, you get absolutely nowhere. Your brain actually starts to hurt.
Yeah, you're just forcing it too hard.
But the absolute second you finally surrender, relax your ocular muscles, and just stare blankly through the poster, the hidden 3D image suddenly snaps into perfect clarity.
Because your diffuse mode synthesizes the image the moment your focus mode gets out of its own way. The visual cortex analogy is incredibly apt here. The focus mode provides the initial sensory input, But the diffuse mode is the architect that builds the coherent structure from that input.
That makes so much sense.
However, this dual mode system has a distinct vulnerability.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, because the focus mode relies on familiar neural pathways, it is highly susceptible to cognitive traps.
Right, because what happens if I fire my mental pinball into a tightly packed cluster of bumpers, but it's the wrong cluster? Like, I'm intensely focused, I'm working hard, but I'm operating on a completely flawed initial assumption.
Cognitive psychologists refer to this dangerous phenomenon as the Einstellung effect.
Einstellung, that's German, right?
Yes, it roughly translates to installation or mindset. It describes a biological roadblock where an idea you already have in mind or a flawed initial thought you have basically installed in your prefrontal cortex actively prevents a better correct solution from being found.
Oh, wow. This is exactly why adults returning to education or professionals trying to learn a completely new software system get so incredibly frustrated.
They jump into the deep end of the pool before they even look at how deep the water is.
Exactly. You see someone open a complex technical manual or a calculus problem, and they just blindly start plugging in numbers. They haven't read the surrounding chapter, they haven't grasped the underlying concept, they just fire off that mental plunger, and their pinball gets permanently trapped in a densely packed area of incorrect assumptions.
And because they're expending so much cognitive energy bouncing around in that wrong area, they genuinely feel like they're working hard, which raises a critical issue about how we deceive ourselves when acquiring new information.
Oh, the illusion of competence.
Yes. The book heavily features the research of cognitive psychologist Dr. Jeffrey Karpik, who studies what he terms labor in vain.
This specific research completely upended everything I thought I knew about studying. Because, I mean, what is the universal default method we all use when we try to learn a massive amount of new material?
We read the textbook.
We read it and then we reread it. And we take a neon yellow highlighter and we meticulously paint every single sentence on the page until the book literally glows in the dark.
Yep.
But Karpik's research proves that this is a massive biological illusion.
It is an illusion of competence generated by visual fluency.
Visual fluency, break that down for me.
So, when you reread a text for the third or fourth time, your visual cortex processes the shapes of the words with increasing speed and ease. The material feels incredibly familiar. Because your eyes are tracking over the sentences without friction, your brain interprets that lack of friction as mastery.
So it's tricking us.
Completely. It sends a signal saying, I recognize this, therefore I know this concept. But recognition is not retrieval. The fluency of the visual processing merely mimics the feeling of deep comprehension.
Okay, I want to pause for a second and actually break the fourth wall here.
Go for it.
If you are listening to this right now, we are going to do an exercise in active participation to prove this exact point. I want you to practice a technique from the book called pause and recall.
This is a great exercise.
So whatever you are doing right now, if you're driving, if you're walking the dog, if you're washing dishes, I want you to look away from your device and try to actively retrieve the main concepts of this episode so far from your own brain. Don't just recognize them when I say them, pull them up yourself.
Try it. What is the difference between the two pinball machines?
What is the German word for the cognitive trap we just discussed? Do you feel that slight mental strain, that friction?
That friction is the biological sensation of actual learning.
Exactly. That is you physically reinforcing a neural pathway rather than just passively letting our voices wash over your auditory cortex.
That retrieval practice, the act of forcing the brain to fetch the information from within its own architecture, is infinitely more powerful than passively rereading.
It actually changes the brain.
It does. When you retrieve, you are thickening the myelin sheath around the neural pathway, making the connection faster and more permanent. Rereading and highlighting do not trigger this biological reinforcement at all.
But I have to ask, if highlighting doesn't actually alter our neural structures, why does it feel so incredibly productive? I mean, is it simply because it mimics the kinesthetic act of doing physical labor?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Like, we have a tool in our hand, our arm is physically moving across the desk, the page is visibly changing color. It really feels like we are physically installing the knowledge into our brains.
That is the precise deception. It provides a dopamine hit associated with task completion. You are confusing the physical coloring of a piece of paper with the complex biological structuring of your mind.
Wow.
To move past these illusions of competence and achieve genuine mastery, the brain must physically alter its networks. And to understand how we facilitate that alteration, we have to look at the limitations of our cognitive bandwidth. specifically through the concept of the mental octopus.
Yes, the octopus. To set this up, we have to clearly separate working memory from long-term memory.
Right.
Working memory is the immediate conscious processing center of your brain. It's like a tiny mental blackboard located right behind your eyes. And the terrifying limitation of this blackboard is that it only has about 4 slots available at any given time.
Only 4.
It can only hold 4 distinct pieces of information. Long-term memory, on the other hand, is the massive distributed warehouse where information is stored permanently.
So when you are in your focused mode, actively trying to grapple with a new concept, Dr. Oakley visualizes your working memory as an attentional octopus sitting in your prefrontal cortex.
I love this image.
Because your working memory only has 4 slots, this mental octopus only possesses 4 tentacles. When you concentrate intensely, that octopus reaches those 4 tentacles down into your brain, desperately trying to connect different neural bumpers together to form a cohesive understanding of the material.
But because it only has 4 tentacles, its cognitive load is easily maxed out. If you are looking at a complex physics equation or trying to understand the syntax of a new coding language, all 4 tentacles are violently thrashing around trying to hold on to separate, disparate pieces of meaningless information.
And you feel completely overwhelmed.
You do, which is where the biological process of chunking becomes arguably the most critical skill in the entire book. Chunking is the act of binding separate pieces of information together through a shared meaning.
The book provides a brilliant, fundamental example of chunking through the process of learning to read. When a child first looks at the letters P, O, and P, they are viewing 3 entirely separate abstract symbols.
Right.
Their mental octopus using 3 of its precious 4 tentacles just to hold on to the phonetic sounds of those individual letters. There is almost no working memory left to comprehend the rest of the sentence.
The octopus is maxed out.
Exactly. But through repetitive practice and semantic understanding, the brain physically binds those 3 neural pathways together into a single shimmering loop. They form the chunk pop.
So it becomes one thing.
Yes. Now, the octopus only needs to use one single tentacle to grasp that entire word, instantly freeing up the other 3 tentacles to grasp the broader context of the paragraph. It is neurologically identical to compressing a massive, unwieldy computer file into a tiny, efficient .zip file.
And when we extrapolate this biological process to complex adult subjects, we realize that mastery requires 2 distinct directional approaches.
Bottom up and top down.
Exactly. You need bottom-up chunking, which is the grinding, focused practice and repetition of the basic elements. But you also need top-down, big-picture thinking, which is the diffuse mode, providing the context of why you are doing it.
Without both, you're lost.
Right. If you only execute bottom-up practice, it's like meticulously crafting 100 individual, beautiful puzzle pieces, but having absolutely no idea what the picture on the box looks like. You have the pieces, but no architecture to place them in.
Conversely, if you only engage in top-down, big-picture thinking, you know exactly what the picture on the box looks like, but you haven't manufactured any of the puzzle pieces required to build it. True expertise is the seamless synthesis of both. You manufacture the neural chunks through intense, focused practice, and you connect those chunks together into a vast network through diffuse context.
This immediately makes me think of the terrifying experience of learning how to drive a manual transmission car.
Oh, that is the perfect analogy.
Think back to the very first time you sat in the driver's seat of a stick shift. Your mental octopus is in a state of absolute panic. It is using one tentacle to slowly release the clutch, one tentacle to modulate the gas pedal, one tentacle to navigate the chaotic H pattern of the stick shift, and the 4th tentacle just trying to keep the steering wheel straight.
Sweating bullets.
Your working memory is operating at 100% capacity. If the person in the passenger seat asks you a simple question about the weather, you stall the car because you literally do not have a spare tentacle available to process auditory language.
You physically cannot do it.
But over weeks of practice, the disparate actions of clutching, shifting, and accelerating biologically bind together. They form one massive, fluid, automated neural chunk called shifting gears. Eventually, your octopus only needs a single tentacle to drive the car, leaving the other 3 free to hold a conversation, listen to the radio, and scan the road for hazards.
That analogy perfectly isolates the ultimate goal of learning. Building a vast library of complex chunks that frees up your limited cognitive resources for higher-order thinking.
It's so empowering to think about it that way.
It is, But, and here's the biological caveat that frustrates so many adults, synthesizing these complex neural chunks requires physiological time.
Right, you can't rush biology.
You are literally growing new synaptic connections. You cannot force a biological organism to grow faster simply by yelling at it. The mental mortar needs time to dry between the layers of bricks. You cannot cram this process into a frantic 12-hour study session the night before a major presentation.
Which introduces us to the ultimate universal enemy of the adult learner, the career changer, and the student. It is the invisible force that prevents us from putting in that consistent time.
The procrastination zombie.
The procrastination zombie, it's such a visceral concept because procrastination is perhaps the most deeply misunderstood of all human behaviors.
We totally misunderstand it.
We culturally frame it as a moral failing, right? A sign of inherent laziness or a lack of discipline. But Dr. Oakley frames it entirely differently. She maps our habit centers, specifically within the basal ganglia, as well-meaning but completely unthinking zombies.
Basically, when a specific cue triggers a habit, our brain essentially switches off conscious prefrontal execution and goes into an automated zombie mode, running a pre-programmed routine.
So if it's biological, why do we procrastinate? Because, I mean, it certainly feels like laziness when I'm watching my 4th hour of a random YouTube documentary instead of looking at my taxes.
It feels like laziness, but the book points out something fascinating about brain imaging. When we merely look at a task, we do not want to do like a terrifyingly complex math equation or a dense legal document of Anne. The insular cortex lights up.
Which does what?
This is the exact same area of the brain that processes physical pain. To the brain, cognitive strain is a metabolic threat. We literally feel a localized ache in our heads. So what does our well-meaning automated zombie do when it senses pain?
It tries to protect us.
Yes, it executes a survival mechanism. It seeks immediate relief. It shifts our attention away from the painful stimulus and towards something pleasant, triggering a release of dopamine.
And in that precise moment, the biological loop is reinforced. You felt pain, you avoided the source, and you were rewarded with dopamine. You feel better.
Until later.
Exactly. Over time, this avoidance mechanism metastasizes into a literal physiological addiction. The book uses a haunting historical metaphor to describe this: the arsenic eaters of 19th century Austria.
The story is so dark, but so fitting.
It really is. These were individuals who, for various cultural reasons, regularly ingested tiny, seemingly microscopic doses of arsenic. In those small doses, the poison didn't seem to hurt them. They actually built up a superficial tolerance, experiencing a temporary flush of health and energy.
But obviously it was destroying them.
Slowly, invisibly, and inevitably, the heavy metals accumulated in their tissues, quietly ravaging their internal organs until it killed them. Procrastination operates on the exact same biological accumulation. Putting off studying a dense technical manual by just one single day feels entirely harmless. It feels like a tiny dose.
I'll just do it tomorrow.
Right. But the cumulative toxic effect of that daily avoidance completely destroys your brain's ability to grow the necessary neural chunks over time.
So the question becomes, how do we defeat a biological pain response? Because just telling yourself to be tougher doesn't work against the insular cortex.
No, it really doesn't.
The ultimate practical hack detailed in the book is shifting your cognitive focus entirely away from the product and focusing exclusively on the process.
Product versus process. This is huge.
Your zombie brain, the part of you scanning for metabolic threats, gets completely overwhelmed by a product. If you sit down and tell yourself, I have to finish this entire 50-page chapter on thermodynamics, your insular cortex flares up. The zombie panics at the massive required energy expenditure, and you end up scrolling through your phone.
Because it's too much.
Exactly. But the zombie is perfectly comfortable with a process. A process is simply an action over a defined period of time, such as, I will sit here and look at this book for 25 minutes.
This specific neurological workaround is the foundation of the Pomodoro technique. Developed by Francesco Cirillo, it is a breathtakingly simple yet profoundly effective tool for bypassing the brain's pain centers.
Anyone can do it.
You set a timer for exactly 25 minutes. During that window, you commit to uninterrupted, focused mode effort. No phone notifications, no switching browser tabs, no distractions. But the crucial mechanism, the part that actually rewires the habit loop, is what must happen the moment the timer rings.
The reward.
You must immediately stop and give yourself a mandatory relaxing reward. You listen to a favorite song, you get up and stretch, you brew a cup of coffee. That reward deliberately activates the diffuse mode, providing a dopamine hit that trains the zombie basal ganglia to actually look forward to the initiation of the focus session.
It's so brilliant.
I have to pause and really look at this, though, because it feels almost humiliating that the highly evolved human brain, capable of building skyscrapers and splitting the atom, can be so easily tricked by a cheap plastic 25-minute kitchen timer.
It really is funny.
Is the trick simply that we are removing the massive emotional weight of completing the terrifying task?
That is precisely the biological trick. You are sidestepping the anticipation of pain. By directing your conscious attention solely to the execution of a 25-minute process, you are actively preventing your brain from conceptualizing the massive, terrifying finished product. You are shrinking the threat.
The threat becomes manageable.
Yeah. And the beautiful irony is that once you sit down, start the timer, and push through that initial wave of insular cortex activation, you invariably find that the task itself isn't actually that painful.
So true.
The pain was entirely located in the anticipation of the work, not the execution of the work itself. Once the mental pinball is bouncing, the pain subsides.
It's a brilliant manipulation of our own neurochemistry. So, okay, once you successfully use the Pomodoro technique to sit down, bypass the pain, and actually do the work, how do you ensure that the information you are processing actually sticks in your long-term memory warehouse?
Right. We've talked about chunking, but how do we make those chunks permanent?
Yeah. This brings us to the evolutionary biology of supercharging your memory and the incredible power of the mind's eye.
To optimize memory storage, we have to leverage the way our brains evolved over millions of years. The human brain did not evolve to memorize abstract mathematical symbols or dense strings of computer code or the periodic table of elements.
Right, those are incredibly recent historical inventions.
Exactly. Our brains evolved to survive in a physical environment. Therefore, we develop a supersized visuospatial memory. We are biologically hardwired to remember the physical location of a fruit-bearing tree, the visual shape of a dangerous predator, and the complex spatial path required to navigate back to our cave.
The book illustrates this evolutionary quirk with the incredible story of a journalist named Joshua Foer. And Foer was not a savant. He was just a totally normal guy with a demonstrably average, highly flawed memory. He routinely forgot his girlfriend's birthday. He constantly lost his car keys. He was just like the rest of us. But as a journalistic experiment, he began training his brain using ancient mnemonic techniques that hijack this visuospatial network. He trained to the point where he memorized staggering, incomprehensible amounts of random data, and he eventually won the United States Memory Championship.
Just from practice.
From practice.
Yeah.
And the core foundational tool of his training was a technique known as the memory palace.
The memory palace technique is amazing because it directly exploits our evolutionary bias for spatial navigation. It involves taking a physical space that you know incredibly well, such as the exact layout of your childhood home or your current apartment, and mentally walking through it.
Okay, so I picture my living room.
Right. As you navigate this mental architecture, you place the abstract information you want to remember into specific locations in that room, but you transform the abstract data into bizarre, wacky, highly vivid visual images.
Why wacky?
Because our neural pathways are deeply wired to remember physical spaces and shocking imagery. When you combine them, the information becomes effortlessly sticky. You completely bypass the biological weakness of trying to memorize abstract symbols by translating them into the language your brain actually understands, physical space and visual anomaly.
And it works for absolutely everything, even the most rigidly abstract concepts like numbers. You don't just stare at the number 18 and try to force your working memory to hold it. You tie it to a visceral, emotional visual.
Give me an example.
Okay, so you picture yourself at 18 years old, packing your bags, feeling the emotional weight of leaving home for the first time. If you need to memorize the number 11.0 for an equation, you visualize an Olympic sprinter exploding off the blocks and running a 100-meter dash in exactly 11 seconds. You are aggressively anchoring the abstract, meaningless symbol to a concrete, dynamic reality.
That's perfect. And this process of personalizing and visualizing information extends deeply into the highest echelons of the hard sciences. Dr. Oakley introduces the concept of equation poems.
The equation poems, I love that.
We often assume that world-class physicists view math as this cold, clinical logic. But Richard Feynman, the legendary Nobel Prize-winning physicist, vehemently argued that mathematical equations are not dead, static markings on a chalkboard. They contain hidden meanings. They possess an internal life and rhythm.
He saw them differently?
He did. Feynman described how when he looked at the letter A, representing acceleration in a complex physics equation, he didn't just visually process a letter. He actively physically recalled the somatic sensation of pressing his foot down on the gas pedal of a powerful car, feeling the G-force press his body back into the upholstery of the seat.
He didn't just memorize the math, he internalized it into his nervous system. He made it a physical, tangible reality in his mind's eye.
Exactly.
I love the story of Barbara McClintock in this section, too. She was a pioneering geneticist who also won a Nobel Prize. When she was trying to understand the incredibly complex behavior of jumping genes, she didn't just look at data sets, she literally used her diffuse mode to imagine herself shrinking down to the microscopic cellular level.
This is so fascinating, May.
She said she actually imagined herself making friends with the individual chromosomes she was studying under the microscope. To an outsider, that sounds almost childish, but neurologically, it is an incredibly sophisticated cognitive hack.
It's profound because when you animate an abstract concept, when you give a chromosome a personality or an equation, a physical sensation, you recruit entirely different neural networks in the brain. You activate the emotional centers, the spatial centers, the kinesthetic centers.
Using whole brain.
You're forming a massive interconnected chunk that makes the concept understandable on an intuitive, almost instinctual level, rather than just a rote analytical level.
It makes me think of that iconic scene in the movie The Matrix, where the character is looking at the computer screens displaying the cascading green code.
Oh, yeah.
To a novice walking into the room, it's just a meaningless, intimidating wall of abstract symbols. It induces the insular cortex pain response. But to the expert, to the person who has spent the time building the neural chunks and internalizing the syntax, they don't see the code anymore. Their working memory isn't struggling to translate it. They look at the green symbols and they see the woman in the red dress. They see the city streets. They see the narrative. The abstract has become a living, breathing story.
And achieving that level of intimate, imaginative fluency rarely, if ever, occurs by sitting passively in a standard classroom while a lecturer talks at you.
Yep.
A teacher can explain a concept beautifully, but they cannot physically construct the neural chunk inside your prefrontal cortex. That biological construction requires the sustained persistence, the self-directed effort, and the deliberate practice of an autodidact.
Which moves us into one of the most empowering sections of the book, Renaissance learning and the supreme power of persistence. Because this exploration absolutely demolishes the cultural pedestal upon which we place the concept of natural genius.
It really does.
We have this ingrained belief that unless you were born a prodigy, unless learning is effortless for you, you have no business pursuing high-level science or literature or engineering. But the historical data entirely disproves this. Sheer, dogged persistence vastly outpaces raw, innate intelligence.
The historical biographies Dr. Oakley provides are a profound testament to neuroplasticity. Consider the life of Santiago Ramon y Cajal, a man universally recognized today as the founding father of modern neuroscience.
Okay.
If the natural talent myth were true, Cajal would have been a childhood prodigy. But by his own documented admission, his baseline cognitive abilities were incredibly lacking. He possessed a terrible working memory, he lacked the quick wit to grasp concepts rapidly, and he was such an abysmal, troublesome student that he frequently drove his parents and teachers to despair over his lack of potential.
And yet he won a Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
He didn't just study the brain, he literally sculpted his own brain through relentless, uncompromising persistence. He utilized the exact visualization techniques we just discussed, treating the microscopic neurons he viewed under his lens not as biological matter, but as living, breathing creatures with intricate social lives and hopes and dreams.
He built the chunks slowly.
He did, and I love the quote he gave later in life, looking back on the brilliant, fast-learning peers and teachers who had completely underestimated him. He said, "Quickness was taken as cleverness, memory for ability, and submissiveness for rightness." What a devastating indictment of traditional rote education.
It perfectly highlights a tragic, systemic flaw in how society evaluates cognitive potential. We heavily reward the students who are quick, who can hold large amounts of data in their working memory and regurgitate it on command. But quickness is not depth. Fluency is not mastery.
Wow, that is so true.
Then the book juxtaposes Cajal with the incredible contemporary story of William Kamkwamba. He was a 15-year-old boy living in a rural village in Malawi, Africa. Due to a severe famine, his family couldn't afford the meager fees to send him to school.
But his internal drive was just insatiable.
Exactly. His need to understand how things worked wouldn't quit. He walked to a small, local library, found an old, donated American textbook called Using Energy, and despite having a very limited grasp of the English language, he painstakingly decoded the diagrams. He used his diffuse mode to understand the principles of electromagnetism, and then he went out into the scrapyards and built a functioning wind turbine for his village out of tractor parts and bicycle frames.
That's unbelievable.
His own neighbors literally called him crazy while he was doing it.
But he brought electricity and running water to his village. He didn't wait for a teacher to spoon-feed him the curriculum. He didn't wait for permission. He became the ultimate autodidact. We see this pattern everywhere, even Charles Darwin.
Right, Darwin is a great example.
We revered Darwin as a monumental genius, but he actually dropped out of medical school because he found the lectures incredibly dull and couldn't stand the sight of blood. He learned on his own, out in the field, as a naturalist on a ship.
He had to figure it out himself.
And when he was struggling in his study to articulate the massive world-altering concepts of natural selection, he used a fascinating cognitive trick. He would imagine that a small child had just walked into his study, and he would force his brain to explain the complex evolutionary theory to that imaginary child in the absolute simplest, most jargon-free terms possible. He basically invented the explain like I'm five concept long before the internet existed.
These historical examples illuminate exactly why self-directed, persistent learning is often biologically superior to traditional passive instruction. When you learn independently, you are forced to bypass what Oakley calls the gulp stage, that passive state of sitting in a chair, mouth open, waiting for an authority figure to drop the answer into your lap.
Right.
As an autodidact, you are forced to actively seek out the answers, to endure the friction of confusion, to cross-reference conflicting sources, and ultimately to build your own robust, deeply rooted neural scaffolding.
Okay, I have to ponder something here, because this seems totally counterintuitive to everything we're taught. Is being a slow learner actually a massive hidden cognitive advantage?
It can be, absolutely.
Because it seems like the people who are naturally quick, the smart kids who always raise their hands first, they look at a complex problem, their fast-working memory spots the obvious pattern, and they jump straight to the conclusion. But by jumping so fast, do they miss the deep, fundamental, structural questions precisely because the answer came too easily?
Yes.
The slow learner has to painstakingly grapple with the foundation, fighting for every inch of understanding. And when they finally build that chunk, they understand the architecture on a much more profound level.
That is exactly what cognitive research suggests.
Mm-hmm.
Fast learners often develop a superficial fluency. They learn the rules of the game quickly, but never question why the rules exist. The persistent, slower learners, because they are forced to engage both the focused and diffuse modes repeatedly over a long period, build deep, highly interconnected, multidimensional chunks of knowledge.
That makes a lot of sense.
However, we must introduce a word of caution here. Even the most dedicated, persistent autodidact has blind spots. You cannot construct knowledge purely in a vacuum without occasionally falling victim to your own cognitive biases. To truly bulletproof your understanding, especially when you are under the intense pressure of an exam or a high-stakes presentation, you must understand how to neurologically check your own work and manage the biology of anxiety.
Which brings us to a fascinating biological reality. We have spent this episode talking about the two modes of thinking, focused and diffuse. But to bulletproof our learning, we also have to talk about the physical anatomy of the brain, specifically the two hemispheres.
Yes. The lateralization of brain function plays a critical role in how we verify our own logic. The left hemisphere of your brain is a phenomenal engine for focused, analytical, sequential tasks. It is what allows you to grind through a complex equation.
But it has a flaw.
A significant, dangerous biological flaw. It is stubbornly, almost pathologically attached to the status quo. It assumes its own calculations are always correct. It does not like to admit errors. The right hemisphere, however, operates quite differently. It has a broader, more holistic perspective. It acts as a mental devil's advocate. It is constantly scanning the environment for global inconsistencies, anomalies, and errors in the left hemisphere's logic.
So when I'm sitting in a high-stakes exam and my adrenaline is pumping, and I race through a complex math problem, circle my answer, and immediately rush to the next question without checking my work, I am literally acting like a person refusing to use half of my physical brain.
You really are.
My left hemisphere is screaming, "Yeah, we followed the steps. The math checks out. Move on." But I haven't paused long enough to allow my right hemisphere to step back, look at the big picture, and say, wait a minute. Based on this calculation, we are saying this sedan is traveling at 4,000 miles per hour. We obviously missed a decimal point.
Precisely. The left hemisphere is blind to its own absurdity if the internal logic seems sound. This neurological reality is exactly why isolated study is ultimately insufficient, and why study groups and collaborative teamwork are so vital.
Because others can catch it.
Yes. Even if you try to step back and check your own work, your left hemisphere can still suppress the right hemisphere's warnings, blinding you to your own typos and fundamental errors. But when you are forced to articulate your reasoning out loud to a group of peers, those peers effectively serve as an external collective right hemisphere. They are not emotionally attached to your left hemisphere's assumptions, so they can instantly spot the inconsistencies that you are biologically blind to.
And speaking of the intense pressure of exams, the book outlines a test-taking strategy that completely subverts every single piece of advice I was ever given in school. It is called the hard start jump to easy technique.
Oh, this is a game changer.
Every teacher I ever had told me to start a test by answering all the easy questions first. They said it builds your confidence, warms up your brain, and secures the easy points. But Oakley argues the exact opposite.
The complete opposite.
She says the moment the clock starts, you should scan the test, find the absolute hardest, most terrifying problem on the page, and load it straight into your focused mode. You read it, you grapple with it, and the absolute millisecond you feel yourself get stuck and the frustration builds, you abandon it entirely and jump to an easy problem.
It seems wildly counterintuitive and almost reckless, but it perfectly leverages the dual-mode architecture of our brain. By loading the hardest problem first, you are gathering the raw materials and handing the clay to your diffuse mode.
Okay.
When you hit the wall and deliberately jump away to solve an easy problem, your focused attention shifts entirely. This active shift allows your diffuse resting state network to fire up and quietly, subconsciously process the complex parameters of the hard problem in the background, while your conscious mind is securing points on the easy question.
That's crazy.
When you eventually return to the hard problem, you will very often find that your diffuse network has mysteriously untangled the knot, and the next logical step suddenly appears obvious.
But I have to push back hard on this, because just hearing you describe jumping away from a hard problem while a clock is ticking gives me massive visceral anxiety.
Scary. Yeah.
If I'm taking a timed certification exam that determines my career, and I look at a problem, realize I don't know the answer, and then abandon it, doesn't that induce absolute panic? Doesn't looking at the clock and feeling like I'm losing control trigger that exact insular cortex pain response we talked about earlier, flooding my brain with cortisol and completely shutting down my working memory?
It is a highly valid concern, and it is the exact reason most people avoid this technique. But the neurobiology reveals that the reality is the exact opposite.
Really?
Yeah. What actually induces a panic attack and a cortisol flood is staring blankly at a hard problem, making zero progress while watching the clock tick down. That sustained failure signals a severe threat to the amygdala, which hijacks the prefrontal cortex and paralyzes your mental octopus.
Oh, I see.
By recognizing you're stuck and immediately jumping to an easy problem, you are securing a tangible win. You are keeping your forward momentum going. This constant progress suppresses the amygdala's threat response and prevents the stress hormones from cascading. It actively manages your biology, keeping your prefrontal cortex calm, operational, and capable of retrieving the chunks you spent weeks building.
Wow. It really is a complete biological operating system. Let's synthesize this massive journey we've just been on.
Let's do it.
We started by completely dismantling the toxic limiting myth of natural talent and the left brain, right brain dichotomy. We learned that by understanding our neuroanatomy, specifically how to toggle between the tight analytical bumpers of the focus mode and the wide open creative spaces of the diffuse mode, we can unravel problems that seem initially impossible.
We covered a lot of ground.
We explored how to build a permanent mental library by constructing neural chunks, how to defeat our procrastination zombies by bypassing the brain's pain centers and focusing on a 25-minute process, and how to hijack our ancient visuospatial evolutionary biology to anchor abstract concepts into unforgettable visual architecture. By internalizing these tools, you no longer just have an operator's manual, you have the blueprints to upgrade the machine itself.
It represents a profound shift in human agency. You are no longer a victim of your initial frustrations or your perceived biological limits. You have the empirical tools to engineer your own expertise, step by step, chunk by chunk.
So I want to issue a direct challenge to you, the listener. Do not simply let these concepts evaporate into the ether of your diffuse mode. Do not let this be another podcast episode you passively consume while driving and then immediately forget.
Put it into practice.
Let these biological mechanics actively enhance your daily life. Whether you are attempting to learn a difficult new coding language, contemplating a massive pivot in your career, or just trying to figure out the intimidating mechanics of your mortgage interest, apply these tools. Set a 25-minute timer and respect the process. Build a neural chunk. Step away from the desk and let your diffuse mode wander.
And I want to leave you with a final provocative extrapolation of this science. We have spent this entire episode discussing how we can sculpt our neural pathways to master external subjects, mathematics, science, technical manuals.
Right.
But the brain's architecture does not distinguish between external data and internal behavior. So what happens when we apply these exact same biological techniques? The deliberate chunking of responses, the toggling into the diffuse mode to gain perspective, the stepping back to avoid the rigid Einstellung effect to our own emotional intelligence.
Oh, wow.
What happens when we utilize these tools not just to solve equations, but to master our complex personal relationships, or to actively deconstruct and overcome our own deeply ingrained cognitive biases?
That is a staggering implication. If we have the neuroplasticity to completely rewire ourselves from math phobes into physicists, we fundamentally possess the architecture to rewire ourselves to be more empathetic, more patient, and more profoundly understanding human beings. It really is the master key to the human experience.
It truly is.
So, your call to action today is clear. Go out and purchase a copy of this book, A Mind for Numbers: How to Excel at Math and Science, Even If You Flunked Algebra, by Barbara Oakley, PhD. And once you read it and begin applying these tools, engage with Dr. Oakley on social media. Share your progress with her. Tell her exactly what terrifying new skills you are mastering. Let the world know that your brain is capable of far more than society, or even you yourself, ever realized.
It has been an absolute privilege to explore the depths of these biological insights with you. The deliberate journey to mastering the architecture of your own mind is undoubtedly the most rewarding and transformative endeavor you can ever undertake.
I completely agree. Thank you so much for joining us and listening to this episode. We invite you to follow, subscribe, and share the Playing Books podcast with anyone in your life who might be struggling, anyone who needs a scientific reminder that they are entirely capable of becoming a genius in their own right. Keep building those chunks, keep pushing your cognitive boundaries, and we will see you next time.